So a few weeks ago I made a live stream where I attempted to cast a product out of epoxy resin in a 3-piece 3D printed mold made out of ABS, and this is the results of that process. And although it is not anywhere what I wanted it to be, I figured this would probably happen, and it gets me closer to the direction that I need to go if I want to mass produce a product at home using a mold process instead of 3D printing the product that I'm trying to make every single time. So let's talk about what I've learned from all this. First off, this failed for a pretty simple reason. Epoxy resin is a pretty hard substance once it's cured. ABS is already a hard substance. So getting these two things to separate is nearly impossible without breaking everything along the way. A mold is typically made of something flexible, like silicone. And the reason for that is because once the substance inside of the mold has hardened, you can just flex the mold around the casted part, and it comes off, and you should be able to get that product. But I was curious to see what would happen with this nevertheless, and it helped me further the design of the mold. You see, silicone is pretty freaking expensive. Have you ever looked at the price of this stuff? To do R&D with it requires a significant financial investment. That being said, there are some things that I can definitely change to, in theory, make this work. So first off, the problem is the mold itself is a hard plastic. That's a problem, because we can't flex the mold around the thing that we've cast. So the next logical step is, if I want to make a 3D printed mold, I'm going to have to do it out of something like TPU, because TPU is flexible. Now let's talk about flexibility of materials. This stuff is rated at Shore 20A. Now your Shore rating is more or less just how flexible the material you're working with is. But the most flexible filament that you could get for your 3D printer and an FDM style machine is known as Ninja Flex, and that has a Shore 85A hardness. Now Shore 85A, to give you an example, because I don't have Ninja Flex on me, might as well be akin to wet spaghetti. You can theoretically print it with a Bowden style printer, but it's more suited to direct drive style printers. Now I do have an E3D Chimera that I might use specifically for this purpose, but for right now we're still talking about the concepts of making a 3D printed mold. So if we have something that's flexible that we can print, then in theory we should be able to, much like the silicone, just remove the mold out of the cast product. Now another thing we need to talk about is the epoxy resin itself. This stuff took quite a while to harden. It says 72 hours to harden, but it's been a few weeks, and there's still some parts to it that are a little flexible, tiny bit of squish. Not enough to be like, hey, this is a problem, but enough to be like, I thought it was supposed to be harder than that. Nevertheless, I think it still will suffice for my purposes, although epoxy resin likes to stick to stuff, which is, well, going to be kind of a problem. There might be other resin choices out there that I want to try, but for the price, it was a good way to test the concept at all. Now, the other problem we have with making a 3D printed mold is look at this resin. You notice the layer lines on the resin cast? That's because, well, it's going to make a negative of whatever it is you're making a cast out of. So the mold, well, technically the mold is the negative and this is the positive, but the positive is going to have those layer lines because the mold is made out of a 3D printed component. The reason I chose ABS to start with to see if it would even work is because if, for whatever reason, the ABS did work, you could vapor smooth it with acetone, and then when you cast something, all those layer lines for your casted product wouldn't be there because vapor smoothing would make the plastic that the mold is made out of super duper smooth, and then it wouldn't look like a 3D printed product. But it doesn't look like that's going to be the case. So we can attack these two problems in one of a few ways. You can use a resin printer to try and get as high detail as possible where these layer lines might not be nearly as visible, and you can in fact get flexible resin for your resin printers and try and do it that way. Although you would need a pretty big resin printer to make the mold that I'm currently trying to make. So my next step really is just getting some NinjaFlex, and perhaps even NinjaFlex might be a little bit too flexible because we have this part of the mold right here that is a thin wall that, when it's a positive, would just be a cavity inside of the product. Something too flexible would be problematic, and I believe I actually have something around here that would show that problem, although I can't find it right now. The main, oh, here it is. So the main issue is if this were to be made out of silicone, which is Shore 20A, it's all flippity floppity. So if this wasn't sitting perfectly in the direction it needed to sit, your cast would have problems because, well, this isn't sitting securely in place. But this is Shore 20A. I think something Shore 85A or Shore 90 would probably be stiff enough where I wouldn't have that problem. That being said, this is going to be a long-term project, and it's part of a type of manufacturing that I'm not entirely familiar with, so I'm just kind of taking you guys along for the ride. So I'm gonna keep documenting things as I go along until I possibly get it right. And if I just can't get it right, then perhaps this particular design will just have to be relegated to something that's 3D printed. So that's pretty much it for the update on the mold. I know some people were asking, but maybe this is not quite the way I want it, but there's definitely some options for me to try.